I think that's my cue. Good morning everyone. And thanks for being here bright and early. I know a lot of you have come from far away, and we are delighted to see you here this morning for the Diversity and Inclusion track, which is running now for a 5th year. And we are very, very excited to be staging this track once again. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are really much, much more than buzzwords. They are essential to shaping the future of travel, and we all have a really, really big role to play here. Today, we'll hear from industry experts from all over the world who are really driving the change that is challenging us, but is also help us towards from fostering inclusive partnerships and addressing gender equity and LGBTQ+ representation across the workplace. We'll explore what's working, what's next, and how we can all contribute to a more diverse and welcoming industry. I'm your track host, Charlotte Lamp-Davies, with management consultancy A Bright Approach, and I'm delighted to have been invited back to moderate this particular wonderful and very, very important track, again, for ITB Berlin. So, we have a lot to get on with, and we need to dive straight in. All the way from the USA, I am delighted to welcome our first keynote speaker, Angelica Guevara, and she is a professor at Indiana University. Now, research-backed, Angelica will challenge us to expand our understanding of DEI to include apparent and, very importantly, non-apparent disabilities. Angelica is herself neurodivergent with reading and writing disabilities, and I am absolutely beyond excited to have her with us here today. We have been preparing, or rather, she has. And now, may I welcome you to the stage. Angelica, let's give her a very warm welcome. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I have been looking forward to this moment and being here today with you and present to you on apparent and non-apparent disabilities. So with that, just thank you for having me, and we'll get started. So I have a presentation for you. And I always tell my students when they disclose their non-apparent disabilities, there is no such thing as a standard way of being. So I usually prepare a PowerPoint, which is entitled Discover the Power of True Inclusivity. I present a roadmap. And I do this because I try to present as inclusively as possible. And what that means is I take into account individuals that have anxiety. And so I present a roadmap so that you know at what point we are in today's keynote. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am. Then I'm going to talk about the ideological shift that needs to happen. Then get into employment, the concept of universal design, the travel industry, and so on and so forth. The next moves at the end, notice I did not call it next steps, and there's a reason. So who am I? Well, I am neurodivergent. My name is Angelica Guevara. I always say I am a neurodivergent Latina with a reading and writing disability. And I purposely say I am because there's some people that prefer people first language, and you see that usually in physical disabilities. But oftentimes in non-apparent disabilities, you're not believed. So often you're gonna see people putting their disability first, as I am the disability, in non-apparent disabilities. Now, what is neurodivergent? Okay, well, just think about a typical brain. And an umbrella term is any individuals who falls into the category of their brain being just processing information differently. So it could be ADHD under that umbrella term, autism, depression, anxiety, PTSD, so on and so forth. So when I first was told that I might have a disability, my first reaction was, to be blunt, F you, I'm not disabled, because of the stigma that's behind that. And the way that I was raised is, if you have a disability, that must mean that God is punishing you. But the doubt seeped into my mind because I was very good at calculus and math, but I couldn't understand why couldn't I process physics or reading. So I could understand the written word by about paragraph to a page, but anything longer than that, it was harder for my brain to retain. So you can imagine how books are extremely difficult for me. So I went to a doctor. And the doctor essentially diagnosed me, and I just lost it. I'm like, no, I need a different diagnosis. I'm gonna go to a different doctor. I want a different opinion. So I went to the second doctor, and I said, you have this all wrong. It has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with how you process information. So I started just to cry out of this feeling of relief. I'm like, there's an answer of why is it that I can't process words like everybody else. So I basically started thinking, okay, what does this mean for the rest of my life? They said, well, you're gonna have your books cut and scanned so that you could hear them. And the reason is because we didn't have, this concept of Audible back then, and if they do, it's usually the popular books, so not textbooks. So I had to have my textbooks cut and scanned. And so they were 2 weeks delayed in law school, which, by the way, a lot of people thought you shouldn't even bother going to law school because it's heavy reading and writing. So had to have my law school textbooks cut and scanned so that I could hear them. And then, obviously, I wanted to become a law professor, and you need, at the time, they were like, you need a PhD, a law degree, and a master's at a minimum to teach at a top law school. So, well, I'm gonna have to do a PhD right after this. They were 5 weeks delayed in scanning my books, but yet I was held to the same grading standard as everybody else. How is that fair? So I started delving into the law and learning more. And as I learned more into the law and the concept of disability studies, I learned that there's a lot of comorbidity. What does that mean? That means that there's often, when there's a diagnosis of a disability, there's also another diagnosis because you're having to deal with a society that sees you as not whole or less than. So the concept of comorbidity essentially is something that I always like to bring up. So what did I do? Well, I'm like, well, I'm gonna prove them wrong. I'm gonna do this because I'm passionate about it, but also, who says I can't do this? So I did the law degree, the master's, the PhD, and on top of that, I did a master's in teaching law. So I did become a professor. I also became a commissioner for disability rights in the ABA. And I'm a former business development specialist for the US Department of Labor of the Office of Disability and Employment Policy. So I like to bring up the concept of do not punish resilience, because with all of these degrees, the concept kept coming up, well, how disabled are you if you got this far? So I want you to think about somebody that cannot move their legs, who's paraplegic, cannot move their legs and leaves the wheelchair behind and is climbing up the stairs by just struggling and forcing themselves to come up just crawling. When they make it to the top of the stairs, do you turn around and you say, well, look, you made it. Do you really need a ramp? So this concept of punishing resilience is like you're damned if you do or you're damned if you don't. So that's often the case with people with disabilities, is the stigma that is behind it is hard to break. So even with all of these degrees, at some point, I was making very low wage, putting labels on boxes because I couldn't get over the stigma of the employer. Is I could do the job, I just need a minor accommodations, which, by the way, the average cost of accommodations is about $500, which a lot of people don't know that. But it's the stigma of the employer that I couldn't get away from. So I start with the premise of conversations and presentations that I have, just talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article number one, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Why do I bring this up? Well, because I do work with business students, and they have a very utilitarian way of looking at things. And I always say, okay, I want you to think about a neurosurgeon and think about a person that has a learning disability or an intellectual disability. And I say, in my classroom, or when I do presentations, is that they are essentially equal in human value. Now, at first, they have like a moment of it just deer caught in the headlights of, what are you talking about? But the neurosurgeon can perform surgeries and can do this, that, and the other. And I'm like, well, let me first talk to you about some stories to counter that narrative of how you view people with disabilities. So let's get to some disability stats. World Health Organization estimates about 1.3 billion people with a disability. Now, the number is much higher because non-apparent disabilities are often not reported. Notice that I say non-apparent. I do not say visible or invisible disabilities because that's ableist. Non-apparent I use because people that are blind, they can see, they just see differently through perception. So, now this number is definitely increasing by aging populations and technological advances. Now, we're talking about this ideological shift of we need to change the way we first view people with disabilities to begin with, right? So that shift that needs to happen within all of us, including myself when I first started, because of that stigma, I didn't want to be a part of the disability community. Now I realize that disability is actually not a negative term. So gets us to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that ideological shift, I was so happy to hear that disability was being included in the conversation, because usually when you think about DEI, you think about race, you think about maybe class, gender, and if we're lucky, sexual orientation. Often what gets ignored is disability and accessibility, right? So, now, disability is a social construct. What do I mean by that? Well, it's socially constructed. So let me give you an example of other societies. The Anango people in Australia do not have a concept of disability. The Mixe in the southern part of Mexico, the Mixe people, if you have a person that has, let's say, an intellectual disability, they don't look at that disability, they just see what the individual can contribute to that community, right? So here's another example of how disability is socially constructed. Alan Turing, computer science, right? Father of computer science, he invented the Turing machine. We all know that today we have, the general model for the general computer was essentially because of his talent, his ability to be able to create the Turing machine. So, example of the construct is one moment you're disabled, one moment you're not, depending on how they're labeling you. Back then, being gay was seen as having a psychiatric disability. Obviously, we know that that's not the case today. So, in the US, the legal definition of disability, just to give you an idea, is it's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. In 195 countries, only 45 of these have disability anti-discrimination laws. 45. Wow. So, gets us into why I talk about the models of disability. Well, I talk about this to have a framework so we can have the same terminology and the same conceptualization when we have discussions about disability. So often what you're going to hear, or what you're obviously been exposed to, is the medical model of disability. But you haven't heard possibly of the social model. And if you have, it has been criticized because it says, oh wait, you're basically having the social model of disability to encompass all these ideologies. And I say, I use the social model of disability because it's the one that counters the medical model directly, and it's the one that starts to open up people's minds as to the way they view people with disabilities. So with the medical model, it basically is this idea that it's a personal tragedy if you have a disability. It suggests that a disability is some terrible chance event that occurs at random to unfortunate individuals. It views that individual with pity as defective or having an impairment that must be eliminated, treated, or cured. Now, the biggest critique of the medical model is that it fixates the problem within the individual while simultaneously absolving society from any further consideration. It perpetuates the stereotypes. Well, it's your problem, perceiving people with disabilities as not whole, damaged, or in need of fixing. Now, the one that is definitely not looking at them as not whole, the ones that counters the medical model, is the social model of disability. That takes into account human variation. There are different ways of existing in the world. The social model essentially empowers people with disabilities. Unlike the medical model, it suggests that society disables individuals. The structures of our society creates those disabilities. There is nothing deficient or wrong with an individual with a disability because there are diverse ways of existing in the world. Now, which gets into just giving you a concept of apparent versus non-apparent disabilities. Helen Keller, deaf and blind, became an author and lecturer. Haben Girma, deaf and blind, graduated from Harvard Law, right? So in what ways are we disabling people? Became a lawyer. Brian Bushway, Brian Bushway, blind and is able to mountain bike and is able to skateboard. What he does is he does echolocation. And what that is a clicking sound with the tongue, so he's able to see what is around him through clicking his tongue. So at times he has to use like a little plastic tool in his bike so that it could be clicking, so that he could also hear and he can navigate the trees, the cars around him when he is essentially biking. So he is teaching that technique to kids. So other ways of looking at the world, because you've had to essentially navigate society, having to problem solve in an able world, right? Now, I've often been asked, excuse me, Professor, do you think that a person with Down syndrome can be an astronaut? And I say, yes, absolutely. No hesitation. Yes, absolutely. So right now we're going into laws and to see what we could do to invest in people with disabilities, because there are people right now that are graduating from college with Down syndrome. There are business owners with Down syndrome. There's an individual that I showed to my students, and obviously for lack of time today, who is not able to, doesn't have limbs, and Nick Vajuvic, who doesn't have limbs, arms, or legs, and is able to swim. And so when I show a picture of Nick Vajuvic without arms or legs, I say, what do you think? Do you think this person can swim? And usually my students are like, no. Well, you'd be disabling him because he can swim. He just swims with his torso. So I give often a lot of stories and narratives to counter that ideology that's out there about people with disabilities. Someone you might have heard of, and that's Temple Grandin. High-functioning autism, created the center track restrainer system, the CTRS. So half the cattle from US and Canada pass through the CTRS. She created this, if you think about it, she created this because she had to navigate disability and figure out what makes her more comfortable, so she was able to design an apparatus for herself to comfort herself with her autism. So therefore, she designed a track system where you don't want to stress out, obviously, the cattle, because otherwise those stress hormones goes into the meat. So design the restrainer system, reducing the amount of stress hormones that goes into the meat, which gets us into employment. Now, we all benefit from universal design, and I'll be talking a little bit about what that is, so that I give you a little picture so that you could see what I mean by universal design. And persons with disabilities have actually saved companies, and one in particular that I could talk about, a Harvard Business Review published on this. A person with a disability ended up saving a company $40 million. Why? Well, because if you think about it, a person with a disability has to navigate an ableist world, so they have to be problem solving all the time. So they see solutions differently. So they have to navigate in an ableist world, right? So illness is separate from disability. If you could understand that concept, you're already halfway there. So illness is that pain or that need of treatment. Disability is how society treats you. The medical model, the illness needed to be stated in a diagnosis in the medical field, but it unfortunately seeped into our society. So if you think about describing people with disabilities, do not perpetuate the idea that not having a disability is the right way of being. So avoid using normal, healthy, able-bodied. Instead, use non-disabled or people with disabilities, right? Other terms to avoid. differently abled, challenged, handy-capable, I hear that one a lot. Do not use handicap because that comes from hand in cap, as if they're beggars. That's historically as if they're beggars, asking for a handout. Or special. So this reinforces the idea that disability is something to be ashamed of. Paralyzed is another one. When you instead of saying, I'm paralyzed with fear or I'm paralyzed with work, say, I was frozen with fear or I'm overwhelmed with work, right? Don't assume that those with a paralysis are stuck. They're not stuck. It's just a society they were born into. I know a lot of people that are authors and make their living in that way are still able to use their mind, right? Do not objectify. People with disabilities simply living do not exist to inspire people. This is also called inspiration porn. Do not objectify people with disabilities. It's very degrading. Gets into the universal design. Okay, here we have a picture where you say, could you please shovel the ramp, this little kid? On the center, it says, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through the shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. But if you just shovel the ramp, then essentially we can all get through. So always conceptualizing a world where you're designing to be as inclusive as possible, because it ends up having essentially third-party benefits. With the travel industry, if you incorporate universal design, you get those third-party benefits. Embrace that human variation. Create most inclusive business practices and services. And the best way that I use, the best thing that I use to be able to show an example is the curve cut effect, right? Here, the curve cut essentially was created so that wheelchair users could go into the sidewalks, right? So it ended up benefiting people with strollers, people that use skates, bikes, right? So think about when you use universal design, it'll have those third-party benefits, which brings us into our next moves, not next steps, because that's ableist language. Shifting your ideology, that ideological shift. Use that universal design concept, right, when designing and providing services. And think about certifying countries as accessible, so that essentially it hurts the dollar, or essentially their economy, if you are not as inclusive as possible. So with that, I thank you so much for having me. I'm very humbly grateful that you were able to be here and listen to this presentation.
What did I say?
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you're gonna need this.
Thank you. What did I say? That was well worth a visit to this particular track, and what an opening. It really, really sets the scene for everything that's to come. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Angelica.